The disciples felt overwhelmed at the prospect of feeding a crowd of 5,000 to 20,000 people, and they didn't have adequate supplies to the task. And that was the whole point. God had set the stage for a miracle in such a way that only He would get the glory for it. God is able. He's absolutely able. In fact, they fed the massive multitude and had left over. This was done through His disciples and through His ministry to show them that He was with them. And now we arrive at another miracle today, the miracle in which Jesus walks on water. And the walking on water was not arbitrary. It was for you. It was promised of old. It was prophesied of the Messiah in the Psalms. It was described in Job 9, verse 8. He treads on the waves of the sea. Job is, chronologically, probably the first book of the Bible that was written. Moses likely recorded the Pentateuch after Job was recorded. This is an ancient book, and it describes Jesus walking on the water. Jesus' walking on water was a perfect demonstration of who He is, how He's master over the elements. And you may be familiar with that if you're a church kid. But you're going to see that John's gospel, remember John's original audience was Gentiles, non-Jewish people who had been steeped in Hellenism, the teachings of Aristotle, taught through Alexander the Great, lived out through Hellenism and Greek thought. John taught his readers about the walking on water miracle in a totally unique and different way. This is the Gospel of John. We're in chapter 6. I'm going to review a couple of things that we covered in devotions, and then I want so we can have a context and have a running start into the walking on water miracle. This is John chapter 6, verse 12. I know what I'm asking of you is big, but I want you to remember who God is. When they were full, He told His disciples, "Collect the leftovers so that nothing is wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces from the 5 barley loaves that were left over by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that He had done, they said, "This truly is the prophet who has come into the world." So you'll hear more about these in the devotions that are available at jessecampbellministries.com and our YouTube channel. Subscribe today, and you'll be given reminders. That way you get every verse of John. They feed the massive crowd. It numbers the men only. The men were numbered 5,000, which means the crowd could be as big as 20,000. It's a massive crowd of people who are miraculously fed, and they have leftovers. And moreover, did you notice that Jesus insisted that nothing would be wasted? Nothing is ever wasted in the economy of God. It wasn't just to show off how much He could do. It was to prove that His provisions overflow. And the number of baskets was deliberate as well. There were 12 tribes of Israel. There are 12 disciples. There are 12 baskets left over. There are 12 gates in the heavenly city. This number was intentional. God was sovereign over the whole thing. He was not the least bit overwhelmed at what overwhelmed His disciples. His disciples were overwhelmed at the size of the crowd and the need that was there and their inadequacy to the task. And you are overwhelmed at the size of the need in this city and our feelings of inadequacy to the task. But God came through and brought overflow. Then He can bring overflow today. He's able. He's able. Nothing is wasted. Everything is intentional in the Word of God. Nothing is wasted. Not your cancer, not your injury, not your financial hardship, not even the death of your child. I've seen it. God uses everything. Nothing is wasted. Anything that befalls us, God is able to take and use for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Nothing was wasted at the feeding of the 5,000, and nothing is wasted in our lives today. They had ample leftovers. Collect the leftovers so that nothing is wasted. This is similar to Ruth chapter 2, verse 14, in which Ruth goes to Boaz, and Boaz in the Old Testament foreshadows Christ. When Ruth received food from Boaz, she had plenty left over. As Boaz typifies Christ in the ancient Old Testament days. This is in the era of Judges, like the darkest time in Israel's Old Testament history. This was a picture of Christ and his provisions and the leftovers that would come. God is taking care of his 12, and he's not done with them either. He's not done with the nation of Israel either. Read Revelation chapter 12 and see the prophesied coming massive, colossal revival in the nation of Israel. God is not done with them. God provided for them amply and had leftovers. God provided for the crowd. God provided for Ruth. God provides for us today, and nothing is wasted. So they collected them and filled the 12 baskets with the pieces from the 5 barley loaves that were left over by those who had eaten. When the people saw this sign, they said, "Truly, this is the prophet who has come into the world." They believed because of this miraculous feeding that Jesus must have been the prophet who was sent into the world. Here's what Jesus is referring to. Here's what John was describing. It's a prophecy in Deuteronomy chapter 18. Right, there are sermons available on the series of Numbers and Deuteronomy at jessecampbellministries.com and the YouTube channel. You can find more about this. I've never seen so many atheists come to Christ in a sermon series as I have in teaching Numbers and Deuteronomy. It sounds bizarre, but what I found was the Christians don't know this book, but skeptics do because it's so awkward. They like to pluck quotes out of context and throw them at Christians and then watch Christians who were never taught the whole counsel of God. In a seeker era of church where all it takes is a pizza party to get you to come to church, you don't want to hear Deuteronomy, you don't want to hear Numbers, you don't want to hear weird parts of Revelation, you don't want to hear all that stuff. The first time you hear it is from the mouth of a skeptic who doesn't believe in God. First time you hear it is from your Intro to Philosophy of Religion professor, freshman year, first semester of college, away from home. And you're wondering why nobody told you this. And as a result, Christians are just inept. They're unable to answer questions from these books. And what I found when teaching Numbers and Deuteronomy was that Christians in their 90s were blessed to hear something for the very first time, and then skeptics saw the weaponized verses in their hands dismantled because they were never theirs to begin with. They were all about Jesus all along. Deuteronomy contains a prophecy that this crowd believes has just been fulfilled in their midst. It's Deuteronomy 18, verse 15. "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him. This is what you requested from the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly when you said, let us not continue to hear the voice of the Lord our God or see this great fire any longer so that we will not die." They were convicted by the holiness of God and aware of their own sin in stark juxtaposition. "Then the Lord said to me, they have spoken well. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him." I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. They believed that this was Jesus, and in part they were correct. However, there's no surrender. There's no acknowledgement of the lordship of Jesus. They are amazed at the free food, and they follow him, and they want more. When Jesus starts to get difficult in his teaching, wait until next week's sermon. The whole crowd just gets skeptical and then disperses. All right, when Jesus starts conveying himself to the elements of the communion meal without explaining it, the crowd just gets freaked out and they all disperse and they all go away. They were just there for the free nachos. And now when things get tough, when things get weird, when Jesus gets hard to understand, they're out. Does that sound familiar? Anybody relate to that at all? Can you imagine that? All right, I'm all about Christianity until it gets weird, then I'm out. That's happening today, and it happened at this miraculous feeding. Jesus is skeptical of this crowd. He wants to see the herd thinned out, and so he does. This crowd was here because they believed that Jesus was going to feed them more. They believed that this is the prophet who has come into the world. But then look at verse 15. Look, Jesus knows their intentions. "Therefore, when Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself." They were going to make Jesus their king. Jesus knew this, and for that reason, he withdraws, gets away from the crowd by himself. He goes to the mountain. His disciples are going to get in a boat and begin rowing toward Capernaum. They know that Jesus is not with the disciples. But I want to talk about Jesus' reaction to their intent. It must have driven his critics nuts when he would call them out on their thoughts. "Why are you thinking what you're thinking?" Man, it'll make him even madder. Jesus knew what they were thinking. This is a guy who just generates free pizza out of nothing. Let's make him our king. This is a craving. This is a craving within people. We crave such a king. We crave such a government that would just give us free food with unlimited resources. We crave that more than we crave freedom. You know how I know that? Because humanity has been repeatedly sacrificing its freedoms in the hopes that they might have Santa Claus for a king one day, over and over and over again. And it doesn't matter how many times we try to deify our government and pray that they'll provide for every last one of our needs. They'll take care of everything that we need. They'll feed us and everything, that over and over again we'll willingly give up freedoms and give up freedoms and give up freedoms. This is cyclical. It's happened over and over again. It seems like no number of mass genocides carried out by socialist regimes will ever drill it into our heads that that's not going to happen until you're in heaven. Think about this for a minute. The governmental structure of heaven. Right, what we have here in the U.S. is a republic. There's some of you are like, I thought we were in a democracy. Right, no, we're in a republic. Write that down. Okay, and as a republic, you know, we pay taxes to a government that funds things that we all use in commonality, like our roads and bridges and things like this, and funds public servant salaries. And I pay my taxes. I render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and that's fine. And I happen to really, really love the country that I was born into. It's all built on one big theological argument. There's no other country like that. The idea that you were born with your freedom, given your freedoms and your rights by God. That's awesome. But I have never placed my faith in any kind of governmental servant. Because I just know, like, I've got sin. All right, I know I've got sin. I know that he's got sin, too. I know that she's got sin, too. Like, whomever we elect, whoever is in charge, they're a sinner like me, okay? All right, and like, if I have bad days, they're going to have bad days, too. I'm not going to place my children's future in the hands of someone that I don't even know. Some elected official who, I mean, if I have sin in my past, I know he's got sin in his past. All right, my faith is not in any governmental official. In fact, I'm really skeptical if somebody looks really squeaky clean. Because I know there's something there. Where are the bodies buried? I know for a fact that whomever we elect is going to have some sort of sin, whether they agree with me and my views or not. I know for a fact there's no such thing as a perfect king. There's no such thing as a perfect governor. This crowd thought that, in fact, yes, this is great. They did find the one person you could ever have as your king who would actually miraculously provide for you. He would actually be able to just literally feed everyone. They would end hunger permanently, and they wouldn't fund it through the overtaxation of his constituents. It would just be from the miraculous manifest powers of God. But that was not what he came to do. He came for something infinitely greater than mere governmental authority. Watch this. Historically observe this and see this repeated. We as people actually don't want freedoms. We consistently sacrifice our freedoms, and our freedoms are gradually eroded over time. Here's what people crave more than anything is a government that will just take care of them. And that's not what governments actually do. We crave a government that would feed us with its own hand. That's what these people saw in Jesus. A free food making king. That's the ultimate king. Right? That's exactly what I want in a government. But Jesus came for something infinitely greater than that. People crave to be taken care of and hand-fed by a governmental authority that they envision to be perfect, and they're so disillusioned over and over again when it turns out the person that they chose to be in charge struggles with sin too. The only time you're ever going to have that perfect economy where it's not a republic, it's not a democracy, demos Krisha, meaning the people rule. It is a theocracy, theos Krisha, meaning God rules. And it's a monarchy because we see Jesus on a throne. Therefore, the governmental structure of heaven is a theocratic monarchy. Every king who's ever existed, my wife and I have totally different views on this. Like, she's fascinated with the royal family. I'm like, they just use people's tax dollars to live at large. They're a relic. I stopped caring about what the throne says in 1776. But every king, every monarch, every queen, every prince, every princess who has ever lived has just taxed the living snot out of their constituents in order to live large. But the governmental structure, the economics of heaven, if you will, are such that Jesus, who miraculously fed thousands of people and had leftover, he is the king in heaven. Everything that we crave, what we want more than anything to be taken care of, to be fed by our king, guess what? That's heaven. It's not earth. The only systems we have right now are these imperfect systems developed by imperfect people and inhabited by people inhabiting imperfect offices. That's all we have for the time being, for now, for the meantime. But there's a day coming when he will, in fact, be our king in a theocratic monarchy wherein he doesn't feed us by taxing us. Rather, he is the one who commanded the universe to exist ex nihilo. He is the one with he is the only king in the universe who actually has inexhaustible resources. And he is able to create and manifest everything, and he will. And he's told us that. I read the end of the book. It's pretty amazing. Look and see what your future king has planned for you. It's absolutely amazing. But this is not that day. Watch for people to crave this from a government that can never give it. Not until heaven. And then look at how Jesus withdrew when they tried to make him that king, because he had more in mind than notoriety. He had more in mind than even earthly authority. He already had all the authority of heaven. All the authority of earth was superseded by his authority. Jesus had way more in mind than just governing one people for one time. He wanted to sit on the throne over people from every nation and every tribe and every language and every tongue from every era of all of human history. That's a significantly bigger vision, isn't it? Do you see why Jesus withdrew now? This puny throne meant nothing compared to the throne that awaits him in heaven. And so to faithfully serve there in the kingdom of heaven, people from every nation and every time period, he withdrew from the crowd. Now the crowd gets wise to this. Continue on in the text with me, verse 16. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. Darkness had already set in, but Jesus had not yet come to them. A high wind arose, and the sea began to churn. After they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea. He was coming near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him on board, and at once the boat was at the shore where they were heading. Now, if you are a church kid, you grew up in church, you're going to church since you were negative 9 months old, you heard this story, and then you in your mind, you just filled in the blanks that Jesus calmed the storm, right? Okay, you know that like the guy sitting a couple rows away from you who was a pagan this time last year actually understands this text better than you do, because John said nothing about the calming of the storm. Did you catch that? The storm doesn't matter anymore. In John's narrative, this story of walking on water, just these few verses, verses 16 through 21, that's it, appears in the middle of a 70-verse long discourse about bread. I mean, it's about feeding the crowd bread. It's about feeding the crowd miraculously. And then there's like the story of walking on water. And then it goes back to why I fed the crowd. Here's what actually happened with the feeding of the crowd. Here's what the bread actually signifies. I am the bread of life. And a massive 70-verse long discourse about the explanation of bread from heaven comes this little story about the storm and walking on water. And we know based on Matthew 14's account of the same miracle and Mark 6's account of the same miracle that his disciples were scared of him because they thought he was a ghost. And we also know from the Matthew 14 and the Mark 6 accounts that Jesus calmed the storm. John makes no mention of that, and he goes straight back to the story of the crowd looking for bread and Jesus explaining to them the significance of the bread. They go out, it's nighttime, okay, evening has fallen, Jesus is not with them. Remember, he's withdrawn from the crowd. They were trying to make him the king over this tiny little province, and his throne is in heaven. His throne is over every nation for all time, for all eternity. He has no interest in this puny throne. Jesus knows that it's for the good of these people who are trying to crown him temporarily, that he could do his ministry. This would disrupt the will of God. It is far better for these people with their bellies full now that he have his eternal crown in heaven one day than he get the temporary crown here on earth. Hello. How many of you are seeking and pursuing just a temporary crown on earth and forsaking the eternal crown of glory in heaven forever? Look at Jesus' model and emulate it. Jesus withdraws from the crowd. His disciples know that he's gone. They take a boat to Capernaum. Now here's a map of the Sea of Galilee. Here's a picture of the Sea of Galilee. Now I've turned it on its axis such that north is to your right. Okay? The Sea of Galilee is roughly twice the size of Lake Washington, just for perspective. And it is 64 square miles. Lake Washington is roughly 33 square miles. And the Sea of Galilee is such that you can at times see all the way across from one shore to the other. But it's also big enough that if a storm hits and you're in the middle of it, you're going to be in trouble. I know this because when I was in college, went to Florida State, my buddy Marshall and I went to the reservation, the Indian reservation that was part of Florida State, and there's this big lake out in the middle of nowhere, and these two sailboats, they're called sunfish, just like with a single sail and a little jib, just came up to the dock. We had never sailed before. But as they came up to the dock, they were like, hey, since it's already rigged, do you guys want these boats? Marshall and I said, well, obviously, yes. No idea what we were doing. Tried to pull it off like as we get away from the dock to make it look like we're totally comfortable and confident. And the guy on the deck was like, oh, you need to pull up the dagger board. I was like, right, the dagger. Using context clues, the only thing that slid up was this thing. I was like, oh, okay, this must be the dagger board. And we just figured out how to sail. I mean, we just swung it around, almost got hit, by the main a few times. And we just went out to sea, and these little sunfish, you just got the rudder in one hand, and you've got a rope, to tighten the sail in the other, and you just go for it. And we went out into the middle of this thing, and we learned how to sail. Apparently, you're supposed to have taken a course beforehand. That's why Marshall capsized his twice. I may have capsized mine, but I actually had a float at the very tip of the mast that kept it from doing it. And so I can tell you firsthand that after that, we went back and we told more of our buddies, hey, you've got to come out. Apparently they have sailboats, and as students, we're just entitled to these, and you're supposed to take a sailing class, but if you're fast, you can just take a boat. And so we just brought more friends out, and then of course a storm would come. And this is in a lake that is about 1 square mile. Okay, it is significantly smaller than the Sea of Galilee, and it was enough to capsize every boat in our group. And in Florida, this may sound odd to you to see, like, how did you not see a storm coming? You had a week's notice on the Weather Channel. Not in Florida. Okay, in Florida, you have maybe 30 seconds notice before a torrential downpour and 70-mile-an-hour winds come every day at 2:30 p.m., and then it's gone right after that. Right? This is just Florida. It's just Florida's on you. And that happened to us while we were out in the lake. Florida! And then a whole fleet is down. And that is in a lake that is 1 square mile. The Sea of Galilee is 33 miles squared. So you can imagine that a sailing vessel way less sophisticated than our sunfish, right, was overwhelmed by the waves and the wind. The wind is what is dangerous. The rain is not dangerous to a boat. Okay, it's a boat. It floats in water. What's dangerous is wind. What's dangerous is waves. So here's the Sea of Galilee. It is massive. Even though you can see across it at certain points, it's still way big enough to do some damage, especially to an unsophisticated first century boat. On the bottom of your screen is likely where Jesus fed the 5,000. At the top of your screen is the city of Tiberias, named by Caesar Augustus, who was the first Caesar of Rome, arguably the most successful Caesar of Rome. He was the one who presided over Jesus' birth and lifetime. And then Tiberius was his patron, and so it's named after him. That's why the Sea of Galilee is also sometimes called the Sea of Tiberias. The city of Tiberias was built by Rome for Jews, but it was built over a Jewish burial ground. And so no Jews wanted to live there. And to this day, Jewish people have issues going to the city of Tiberias because it makes you ceremonially unclean to go there. So the Sea of Galilee and the Sea of Tiberias are the same body of water. It's this one. When the narrative describes Jesus' disciples going to Capernaum, that's on your right side of the screen. Okay, Capernaum is on your right side of the screen. That's on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Nearby is also where Mary Magdalene and Lazarus and Martha lived in a nearby town called Bethany. But Capernaum is where it was kind of like a home base for much of Jesus' ministry. It's on the northern coast of the Sea of Galilee. And so when you hear the narrative play out, this crowd is at probably the eastern shore, the southern part of your screen, and the disciples go to the right side of the screen, Capernaum. They go to about 2 or 3 miles out before the storm hits. The next day, boats arrive from Tiberias, which means that they're going from across the Sea of Galilee, the top of your screen, to the bottom of the screen, and the crowd uses these boats to then go to the right of the screen to find Jesus in Capernaum. Now, for perspective, the text says in verse 19 that they had made their way out 3 or 4 miles. That's where the storm hits. So when they're en route from the bottom part of your screen to the right part of your screen, they're deep into the Sea of Galilee by about 3 or 4 miles. And this is where the storm arrives. But did you notice something? There's a second miracle within the text. Not only do they see Jesus walking on the water, but did you see how the passage ends? Then they were willing to take him on board, and at once the boat was at shore where they were heading. And I am like worse than an armchair cartographer. Some of you guys have heard stories about my mishaps with maps in the past, so I'm going to do the best. I'm going to take this with like a shaker of salt. If they were 2 or 3 miles out from the southern shore or the eastern shore on the way to the northern shore, that means that Jesus miraculously transported them to Capernaum, a distance of 1 or 3 miles instantaneously, depending on your interpretation. So not only did he walk on water, but he brought the boat exactly where it was supposed to be. There's a second miracle within the miracle. They've rowed out into the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is not with them, at least as far as they know. Darkness had already set in. A high wind arose and the sea began to churn. That's verse 18. After they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus. Can you just look at those words in your Bible real quick? They saw Jesus. That's sufficient. That's everything that you need. Would you look to Jesus above the waves and the torrent and the winds and fear no longer? He is sufficient. Then they saw Jesus. That's enough. They saw Jesus. That's all that you need. They saw Jesus. And he was coming near the boat, and they were afraid. They were afraid of their Savior. They trembled at their best friend. They didn't understand him. They thought that they were alone. They thought that he had abandoned them, but he was there with them in the storm. I'm going to ask a question, and you're going to know the answer to this question just a few words in. Was Jesus able to prevent the storm from even happening at all? Of course he was, but he didn't. Why? Was Jesus able to prevent the storm that you're currently in? Yeah, he was able to, but he didn't. Why? Would you look out on the waves and see Jesus? Just see Jesus. That is enough. That is enough. His perfect love casts out all fear. That's everything. Jesus is there. The storm is not somehow, as is often misconstrued, proof against his existence. No, the storm is his. He is in the storm, and he is with you. He walks on water to get to his disciples. And his promise is true. I'll be with you always, even when you don't see him, when you don't know that he's there. The silence of God is not evidence of the absence of God. He's there in the storm, on the waves. They belong to him. He's sovereign over them. He could have stopped this storm, but he didn't. Now, why? And the sooner you embrace and face that, the more God's going to minister through it. My family and I have been through just such a similar storm in recent months. Like, I have never read so many lies written about me in my life as I have in the last 6 months. Written by Christians. Like, the greatest cruelty I've ever received is all at the hands of people who profess to know Christ. publishing outright lies, costing me opportunities. It may have cost me a real estate deal just a few days ago. Like, I've never seen something like this. I mean, we went a long time without any income. It was brutal. It was absolutely brutal. But God brought us across. I look out and I see you, and I see the Redemption Church. I see the 10:15 service, and I see people sharing their faith on the prayer cards, and I see why. I see Jesus. I see Jesus in you. It's brought us through. It's brought us across. It's absolutely incredible. He was sovereign. He was able to prevent the storm from happening in the first place, but he didn't. And why? I look at you and I see why. You are my why. Jesus was able to have prevented the storm that your family is facing as well, but he didn't. Why? He is there with you. He is atop the waves. He is sovereign over the storm. We know based on experience in the Gospel of John, he could have turned the whole sea into wine if he wanted to. He's already proven his sovereignty over the elements, proving what is claimed of him, the very opening verses of this book, that he was there in the beginning, that he was in the beginning with God. He is able. He is able. He is able. Imagine this from the perspective of the disciples, because at first they're overwhelmed at the size of the crowd, and then Jesus. And they don't know how they're going to feed the crowd, and then Jesus. They have leftovers. And then they're overwhelmed by the wind. They're overwhelmed by the waves and the darkness, and then they see Jesus. Jesus is proving to them something that is relevant to what approaches in the text. As we continue our way through John chapter 6, you're going to see the story about the bread come back up again. And here's what's really cool. He's going to meet a massive crowd of people, and in your curriculum, in your small groups throughout the week, you're going to study this passage, and you're going to see this crowd who has already seen him perform massive miracles ask him, okay, so what miraculous proof are you going to give us to prove that you're Jesus, like that you're God? What other miracles? These people had already seen multiple miracles. Like, I literally just fed you a miracle yesterday. I know you're asking me what proof I'm going to give you. And he doesn't even mention this miracle to the crowd. He doesn't say anything to them about the storm. He doesn't say anything to them about having walked on water. This was just for his disciples. Do you see that? It's just for them. They were the ones who were being commissioned by the end of this whole thing. He was going to leave. He was going to ascend into heaven, but he's going to be with them always, even to the very end of the age. How is that? By the power of his Holy Spirit. We have something better than Jesus standing on the waves next to us. We have the Holy Spirit of God within us, Christian. Jesus assured his disciples that he was with them by proving it to them. Not by keeping the storm from coming, but by standing on it and bringing them where they wanted to go. Did you see the timing of when they arrived? When did they arrive? When exactly did they arrive? Then they were willing to take him on board, and at once the boat was at shore where they were heading. The boat arrived immediately on shore with the moment they were willing to do what? Take him on board. Where is Jesus taking you? Would you stop trying to row yourself? Would you just take Jesus on board and you'll be there? Did you see what he said to them? They were scared. A high wind arose, the sea began to churn. That's verse 18. After they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea. He was coming near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, "It is I. It is I." This echoes Exodus 3:14. I am. There are multiple I am statements throughout the Gospel of John. Some argue 7. I see more. This could constitute one such statement. It's me. All right, you're looking at the storm and the waves, and Jesus is like, it's me. I'm the one behind this. I'm here. And now you're where you're supposed to be. He showed his disciples that just like he provided for the crowd, he's going to provide for them. Just like he has more than enough resources to have leftovers after feeding 5,000 people, even 5,000 people who don't get him, who don't understand him. They felt overwhelmed at the prospect of ministering to a massive crowd of people who did not understand him. Am I talking to any Seattle Christians right now? Jesus ministered to his disciples to prove to them that he was with them, while they ministered to the massive crowd of people who just didn't get it. This miracle takes place right in the middle of that. That massive crowd of people takes a bunch of boats from Tiberias to Capernaum to follow Jesus to a synagogue, according to verse 59 of the following chapter, that he's going to show them and explain to them why he miraculously fed them and why they don't get it. And spoiler, the whole crowd's just going to disperse anyway. But Jesus' disciples remain there. This teaching about the walking on water takes place right in the middle of this massive 70-verse long discourse about bread to a massive crowd of people who don't get it. And the purpose of it, it was just for his disciples to show them that he's with them. Jesus is with you while you bring the gospel to Boeing and you are the token Christian in your division and you feel like the only saved person in all of Amazon, and it's like Christianity is outlawed in Google's office, especially if you're a white male. God help you. And you feel utterly overwhelmed and outnumbered and outgunned. Can you relate it all to the disciples trying to feed a massive crowd of thousands of people? Do you know that this was a private miracle? This was not for mass consumption. This was just for the disciples and for you right now. Because you didn't notice this until now. John leaves out the calming of the storm. He just includes it here. As far as the crowd knows, they're not here for this. As far as the crowd knows, Jesus caught some weird little Uber night boat. And he makes no mention of it. It was just to prove to his disciples, I'm sovereign over this. I'm bigger than this. I can feed that entire crowd and have leftovers. I can walk on the waves. They're mine. Jesus is able. It's on him. It's not on you. If this were on the disciples, this story would have ended a chapter ago. In fact, it would have ended in chapter 2. In fact, it would have ended before chapter 1. Like, none of this would have worked. It's always been on Jesus. It's never been on you. Stop taking credit for what God does anyway. It's on him. He's got this. He's got the waves. He's got it all. He can handle this. He doesn't actually need your help. You're just privileged to be enlisted and commissioned into his mission. That God would use you to reach the massive crowd of people who just don't get him. So armed with such boldness, speak up by the water cooler. Watch God turn it into an altar. This passage should be sufficient for you to know that God is sovereign over water. He can handle the Sea of Galilee. He can handle your Culligan water in the cooler. Yes? God is sovereign over all of it. It's his water. So make him turn it into an altar. Bring up the gospel. Talk about Jesus. Let it be known you believe in him because he stood by you on the waves and in the storm. He was faithful to you. He's provided in the past. He has always provided in the past. He's providing for my family right now. It is miraculous. It is awesome. It is amazing. God provides. He has more than enough. There's always leftovers with him. I'm not asking you to do something I'm not doing myself. Step out and trust Jesus and speak up boldly. Your reputations on Google are way better than mine anyway. So speak up and share the gospel. Share Jesus. He was with you in the storm. He provided for the crowd. He can provide for you. I know what I'm asking you to do can seem overwhelming, but I know that Jesus is able. So I'd ask if you stand with me as we close in prayer, and I want to pray a couple of prayers. I want to pray on behalf of those who are far from God. And I want to pray on behalf of the Christian. I want to pray on behalf of the Christian who is just afraid of bringing up the gospel to this massive crowd of people who are skeptical. So let's stand and let's pray together. God, I pray for my skeptical friend who just wandered in here to hear this seemingly familiar story of you inventing surfing. But God, there's something else to this. It wasn't just arbitrary. It wasn't just like a look what I can do. It was to prove to your disciples that you were with them. And I believe that you're with us now. I believe, God, that you're real. I believe that Jesus is your son. I believe in every miracle we've just read today. And I believe more importantly, not just that he can miraculously make bread to feed thousands of people and walk on waves, but that he went to the cross to atone for my sin. And he rose again from the dead. And I believe in Jesus as Lord. Not just a miracle worker, not just a bread maker, not just a water walker, but Lord over my life. And so I repent from sin. And God, I lift up the disciples in the boat right now. Members of the Redemption Church who feel overwhelmed at the daunting specter of one of the most lost cities in the U.S. and bringing up the gospel. God, this does not overwhelm you at all. You have enough grace to feed every person in this city and have 12 baskets left over. You are not overwhelmed at all by the size of the Puget Sound or Lake Washington. You walked on the Sea of Galilee, and that's twice its size. You are not overwhelmed by any of this. You're not overwhelmed by argumentative atheism. You're not overwhelmed by the spread of paganism. You're not overwhelmed by any of it, God. None of this overwhelms you. You overwhelm the things that overwhelm us, so we will speak up, God. You are sovereign over the storm, and you are walking in the midst of it, standing over the waves. So God, you are faithful with us on the mountain. Would you be faithful with us in Capernaum? We're going to bring up the gospel to our family members. We're going to bring up the gospel on social media. We're going to bring up the gospel to our coworkers. We're going to bring up the gospel to our neighbors. And God, it may cost us standing. It may cause us to have awkward interactions. It may cost us opportunities. God, it may affect us in some way, but you're worth it, and you're able, and you can do this. Your grace is more than sufficient to feed everybody in the whole city of Seattle and have leftover. So would you do it, God?
Yes.
Would you do it? If you need prayer for anything, would you come forward? You pray with Debbie and Brian right here at the altar. Come forward and pray. Let's worship together.